The security guard laughed like it was a private joke he expected me to be part of. He didn't mean to hurt me. He was only being friendly. But his laugh landed in my chest like a hand grabbing my throat. I was halfway up the marble steps, coffee in my left hand, clutching the strap of my new blue dress with my right. I had practiced the knock in the car on the drive over. Light, confident, the kind of knock a woman makes when she's about to surprise the man she loves. David's building smelled of lemon cleaner and old money. The lobby was all glass and brass and soft echoes. A digital directory hummed beside the elevator bank, names and titles, logos, a small photo of smiling executives. Beneath David Henderson's listing, an appointments panel scrolled the morning's visitors. My name was not on the list. Below his title, in neat type, listed as a recurring visitor, was a name I had not expected to see. Mrs. Henderson. No first name, just that. The little thumbnail beside it wasn't my face. It was Sarah's. There are moments when your brain keeps time with your heartbeat, and every second slow drips like molasses. For me, that split second lasted long enough to hear my coffee slosh against the lid, to see my reflection in the directory glass, blue dress, smile prepared, brand new heels, and to hear the guard say it loud enough so everyone could hear. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson," Tom called, nodding toward a woman stepping through the revolving doors. She walked like she owned the place. The same familiar walk she'd had since we were kids, and she borrowed my clothes without asking. Only now she had his posture too, the practiced tilt of someone's chin who'd learned to be seen and not questioned. My sister. "That's her," Tom said again, pointing. "Mrs. Henderson, right on time." I must have made a sound, less of an intake and more of a wordless question, because Sarah looked up. Her eyes went wide in that human, guilty way that makes you think someone is going to offer you an explanation for everything and make it all better. My hand tightened on the coffee until the lid snapped. David stepped out of the elevator, suit perfectly tailored, a grin already warming his face as if he'd expected a cake or at least a bouquet. He waved. He was used to being adored. He lived on charm the way some people live on oxygen. "Margaret," he said, as I stepped off a stair I didn't remember climbing. "What a—" His voice cut off when he saw me. The grin flickered, and the lines around his mouth went thin. He looked from me to Sarah. For a terrible second I watched the math in his head, my presence against the fact of Mrs. Henderson already there, add up to something he had not planned for. Sarah smiled like a woman who had rehearsed her smile in the mirror. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she said. Her voice had that sugary tone she'd used to get out of everything when we were teenagers. "Traffic was something today." "And you are?" I said. It was the simplest question in the world. The kind of question you ask when the world has tilted and you need to find which way is up. People around us seemed to fold their conversations around our little knot, like they could sense the electricity in the air. A woman in a business suit paused. A couple at the concierge desk traded a look. To them, it was entertainment. To me, it was a crucible. Sarah blinked. David gave a thin bark that might have been a laugh. He started, and then stopped. "Margaret, can we talk?" "Right here?" I said, louder than I intended. The lobby seemed to expand, hearing the click of someone's heel become an accusation, every step a footfall against my composure. My surprise had been intended for a birthday, a private moment, cake, a laugh, an awkward joke about aging. Instead, I stood with a cup of coffee and a dress bought for a happy lie. There are times you wish for a private room. Instead, I had marble and brass and witnesses. Tom's face had that blend of embarrassment and curiosity that nonchalant middle city security guards get at these small theater moments. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, meaning no offense, meaning everything. "We get a lot of visitors." "You get a lot of women calling themselves me?" I said. My voice was sharper than I'd expected. David's jaw clenched. Sarah's smile thinned into something else. Defensiveness, maybe, or the first line of a story she hadn't yet perfected. "You're making a scene," David said, quick as a whip. Come on, love, let's go somewhere quiet. We can talk upstairs. Upstairs, I repeated. The 97th floor office with the view my husband keeps bragging about, but not to his wife? Right, people murmured. Someone's phone lit up. 1,000 tiny witnesses to the slow demolition of what I thought I knew. That should have been my first clue, I thought later. The casual way Tom greeted Sarah, as if this had been going on for months. But back then, in the cold light of the lobby, the details were shards in a bouquet, a hand on a rail, a laugh, the directory that refused to show me as anyone's partner, and a sister who stood there like a cat with a mouse. If you're hearing this and your stomach turns, if your pulse shoots at the idea that someone you love might be a stranger with a smiling face, leave a comment with your city and hit like. More people need to hear how these things start. I walked toward the concierge as if toward a cliff. My heels clicked on marble. David reached for my arm. He should have steadied me. Instead, his fingers sought control. "Margaret," he said in a voice that was supposed to be soft and soothing. "Please." "Please?" I echoed. "Please? That's the word you're choosing?" I wanted a story. I wanted the ridiculous, ordinary explanation. Sarah is moving in temporarily. The security guard meant nothing. The directory had a glitch. I wanted to smile and let it go and keep the life that had become familiar to me. Instead, I felt the exact point where the lie met the real world. Sarah's voice was small, like pleading. "Mags, I didn't mean for it to look like—" "Don't call me that," I said. Her nickname had belonged to a childhood I was not prepared to share with the woman who'd pulled on my coat and taken my holidays. David looked at Sarah as if she were a piece he'd misplaced and then found. For the first time, his composure slipped, not because he was afraid, because he could calculate outcomes and realize quickly that having me here unannounced might not be to his benefit. He leaned toward the concierge. "Tom, this is my wife, Margaret." Tom's face collapsed into a mask of polite confusion. "Oh, wow," he said. I'm sorry," I thought. "I am his wife," I said. "I am Margaret Foster, Mrs. Margaret Foster. Not Henderson, never Henderson, not any more." That last clause felt ceremonial. I hadn't said the words out loud before. They tasted sharp and strange in my mouth. David's eyes went hard. "We don't need to make a scene," he said. "Too late for that," I answered. The elevator doors pinged closed behind him like the door of a train leaving a platform, final and indifferent. I left without making the grand reveal I'd rehearsed in the car. No dramatic tearing off of a disguise, no triumphant speech, just the kind of quiet that comes from realizing you are a fictional character in someone else's story. I walked out into the city as if the sun had shifted slightly, and I was now a stranger beneath it. On the drive home, I replayed scenes like a broken film. 7 months before, we'd been at my mother's funeral. The small church smelled of lilies, and everyone had said the right things about grace and family. David had been a rock then, attentive, stoic, the kind of man who could narrate crises and make everyone feel as if they'd been included. A week later, the company had announced his promotion. He would be commuting, 2 hours each way. He said it would be temporary, that he'd need a foothold downtown. He told me it was good for us, more pay, more stability. He promised to be careful. 3 months after his promotion, my sister Sarah moved back in with me. She said it was only for a few weeks. She was between apartments, she said, her voice close and earnest. And I had said yes, because that's what sisters are for, right? You take in the broken ones. You offer a spare room and a spare set of keys. Looking back, ordinary kindness is often the place deception takes root. You let someone in, you lend them a coat, and one day they are wearing your life like a garment. I had no idea how far she was willing to go. I pulled into my driveway and stood for a long time in my car, the engine ticking, the city hum dimming behind me. I looked at the blue dress in the passenger seat, the cup of coffee cooling in the cup holder. I thought about the subtle ways trust becomes daily. The phone on the counter left for someone else to answer. The small memo on the fridge about grocery lists. The habit of speaking to a chair across a table and expecting it to be filled. My kitchen was full of ordinary debris. A jar of pens, a stack of gardening catalogs, receipts from places we'd once gone together. In the living room, a framed photo of my mother leaned against the mantel. I set the coffee down, and then, on a sudden impulse I didn't even understand, I picked up the frame. The glass was warm from the sun. I turned it and watched my own face, 7 months younger, wearing a coat my mother had knitted. David's arm was around me, his tie half askew because of the wind that day, our faces close and happy and foolish. I let the frame slip out of my hands. It hit the hearth, and the glass spiderwebbed into 1,000 polite fractures. For a moment, all I felt was the small, sharp sound of something ordinary breaking. Then I felt more. Embarrassment, grief, the slow, certain recognition that one life had been a facade erected by other people's convenience. Sarah's footsteps came down the hall like a question mark. She stood at the doorway with a small paper bag in her hand, the sort you get from a deli. "Mags," she said. "Don't call me that," I said. The words were a dent in the air. She shrugged, too practiced. "I didn't mean to hurt. Save it." Tears came hot and then cold. I was too old to let tears be the only thing I offered. It was anger now, an instrument that helped clarify. You don't get to tell me, "I didn't mean to," and then sit back on the sofa as if everything's fine. You used my name at my husband's office. She blinked. He asked you to what? To pretend to be his wife? To sit in his life like you were a patch on a shirt? Does he know you were renting the place out where the money was supposed to be going? Sarah's face changed then. It was the first time since the funeral I'd seen anything other than gamine mischief. There was a flicker. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "It isn't like that," she said. "You have to trust me. He told me what to say." "What did he tell you to say?" Her mouth worked. "Just that he'd introduce me as someone who helps him with his charity work, that you'd understand once you heard. I swear I thought it would be temporary. I didn't know about money. I didn't." How many times had I wanted to believe her? When we were 16 and I hid a failing grade, she hid it better. When we were 24 and my heart was broken, she let me sleep on her couch and made soup that tasted like Florida. Family is a minefield filled with familiar maps. It's hard to believe the people who hold the clipboard are the ones who set the traps. That night, I opened David's desk drawer. His home office was supposed to be a place of neat receipts and tidy pens. Instead, I found envelopes in his handwriting neatly labeled with dates and sums. A spreadsheet on his computer bore the name Henderson Investment Trust, and beneath it were lines of transfers, shorthand notes, pending, CK, wire out, Cayman, client meeting, Amanda. My hands shook so badly I could hardly click the mouse. I worked the way people work when something feels like a business audit of their soul, with focus and fury. I printed bank statements. I matched signatures. There were names I didn't recognize and numbers that didn't make sense. A transfer labeled emergency funding went out 18 months ago. An account we'd considered dormant had been emptied. The math of betrayal is cold. People imagine affairs as sharp, singular incidents, an isolated betrayal that you can point to like a bruise. Fraud, though, is architecture. It's careful and patient. It sizes up someone's trust and then constructs a system to exploit it. Forged documents, offshore accounts, transfers disguised as corporate expenses. The more I dug, the more the pattern emerged like the outline of a building on a foggy morning. There were phone calls I couldn't account for, emails I couldn't fully access. But I found one document that made my stomach drop, an authorization form with a signature that looked like my own. My name scrawled across the bottom, Margaret Foster, granting permission to transfer funds from an account we shared to an entity I had never heard of. The signature bent the same way the edges of my mother's handwriting used to curl. Someone had done a good job, or someone had fooled us both. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn bled into everything, and I made a decision. There are two kinds of people in this world: people who let things happen to them, and people who make a noise about it. For most of my life, I'd been the type who let things happen until they either resolved or didn't. This time, that was not an option. Trust had been weaponized against me. My identity had been repurposed for other people's gain. I felt an old heat rise in me, the kind of heat that had, in earlier years, made me a competent project manager, a woman who could organize a charity bake sale and a holiday schedule with equal skill. I called Helen Morrison first because she's the kind of lawyer my mother used to say you call when you think the world might be askew. Helen's voice on the phone was trimmed with efficiency. No drama, just a list of questions and a calendar. "Bring everything you have," she said. "Bank statements, emails, checkbooks. And if you have any suspicion of fraudulent transfers, don't change anything. We'll get a forensic accountant on this." "Do you think—" I began. "I don't think," Helen said. "I look at evidence. Bring it. We'll proceed." That tiny sliver of procedure felt like armor. Having a plan is a defense against hysteria. It was a lifeline that smelled faintly of paper and attorney's billing. I called Marcus Webb next. He is the sort of man who pays attention to patterns most people miss. Vanity plates, the rate at which someone's voice changes when they're lying, the discrepancy between a neat signature and one that twitches. He came recommended by a friend of a friend, the kind of discreet, gray-haired professional who knows how to dig into accounts without tripping over headlines. "Do you want me to start with bank traces?" he asked. His voice was flat and calm. He had the useful quality of not using exclamation points in crises. "Start wherever you like," I said, "but be quick." "How many victims?" he asked. At this point, I don't know. The admission felt terrible and freeing. "I'll run the usual checks," Marcus said, "and if there's fraud, we'll find the paper trail. Offshore accounts aren't invisible. They're just a series of doors someone paid to be locked." I met Helen and Marcus the next morning. We sat in a small conference room at Helen's office. She had taken my file and set it between us like a verdict not yet read. Marcus had already started. An initial list of transfers, a lookup of corporate registrations, a note that one of Henderson's holdings had been registered in a tax haven 18 months earlier. The pieces I thought I had found at random, an empty account here, a suspicious transfer there, began to line up into something that looked like strategy. "How many others have you spoken to?" Marcus asked. "Only Sarah," I admitted. Saying her name out loud made the room smaller somehow. "Start gathering the emails, the memos, the hard copies. We'll subpoena the banks if we have to. But for now, every piece you have could be useful." There was a legal realism in Helen's tone that kept me steady. Nothing was promised. Nothing was guaranteed. That was both terrifying and oddly honest. For the first time since the lobby, I felt like I had an axis to pivot on. At home, I called Jennifer, Amanda, and Christina. Jennifer picked up on the second ring. Her voice was raw. "He told me he needed cash for a business emergency," she said, and my heart punched. "Said he'd pay me back next month." Next month became next year. Then he stopped answering. Amanda's voice was a flat, tired register. "I thought I was investing. He gave me a prospectus and told me to trust him." I trusted him. Christina's laugh at the end of her sentence was bitter. Every time I called, he'd charm me. He'd explain. He'd tell me I was being cautious. I didn't want to be that woman. They weren't dramatic. They were not the people who wanted television interviews. They were ordinary, and that ordinariness made the betrayal feel worse. The four of us started texting in a tight group, a private, angry, grieving caucus. We compared dates, receipts, emails. We compared the little ways a con man repeats himself. The language of fraud is repetitive. The invented emergency, the nickname he uses, the slight impatience with questions. We began to see the pattern, but even as evidence gathered like storm clouds, so did complications. Sarah called, crying now, telling me she'd been manipulated, that she'd only wanted to help, that she hadn't known about the transfers. "I thought he loved me," she said, and the line between sister and accomplice blurred in ways I didn't know how to describe. Could someone be both victim and participant? The law is less nuanced than family. Family is more fraught than law. I slept badly, and then not at all. I kept replaying the lobby, Tom's laugh, the directory that had shown me someone else where I should have been. The public humiliation had an odd alchemy. It turned private betrayal into spectacle. People who had once nodded politely at me in the grocery store now passed with the slightly too bright eyes of someone who knows a secret without context. My life had become a conversation I had not authorized. Let's be clear, revelation can be brutal, but it also clarifies. The necklace you thought was just an accessory becomes an evidence bag. The signed authorization form becomes a key. The thin slice of a file you found in a drawer is suddenly significant. Things that were puzzles now fit into an outline. I began to plan like someone putting together a complicated jigsaw. Small things first, gathering bank records, printing emails, making a list of people to call. Bigger things too, talking to the FBI if needed, preparing civil paperwork, organizing the other women so we weren't scattered victims but a collective voice. Each step felt like reclaiming a fraction of my life that had been lent out without consent. A week after the lobby, I stood looking at the rows and rows of printed bank statements on my dining table. They looked like an accusation in black and white. I had a line item, a transfer to a company named Henderson Global Holdings, an amount that had been debited to an account that no longer had the balance we thought it did. My hands hovered over the phone. I could call David and demand answers, or I could walk into his office and shout what I knew like a woman with nothing left to lose. Instead, I did something I'd done rarely in my life. I took the slow, methodical route. I boxed the statements, labeled them, photographed them. I sent the images to Marcus. I scheduled a meeting with Helen. I texted Jennifer, Amanda, and Christina to say, "We need to talk in person." The world had given me witnesses. I'd been humiliated in public, but that humiliation had hardened into resolve. I was angry, yes. I was humiliated, certainly. But I was also seeing the outlines of a plan I could walk into. That night, I went back to the mantel and picked up a different photograph. One of me alone, older now, with my hair shorter and my smile genuine. I had to remind myself that the woman in the pictures was still me. Names could be borrowed, signatures forged, bank accounts emptied. Bones were harder to steal. I called Robert Chen and told him to meet me for coffee the next afternoon. Robert had been a friend for years, an honest man who ran a small architecture firm and had a laugh that felt like sunlight on granite. He'd known me before David. He asked no questions when I told him, and that was permission enough to breathe. I didn't tell him everything over coffee. I told him more than friends sometimes tell each other about a bad week. He listened as if my words were a ledger and not a spectacle. At one point, he reached across the table and held my hand, like you hold a map for someone who has lost their way. "You're not alone," he said. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a promise. It was a fact, and facts are sometimes the best kind of medicine. The next morning, I went back downtown. The security guard recognized me and said, "Ma'am," with a softness that almost made me forgive him. I didn't forgive him, but I was learning to be strategic rather than theatrical. I had plans now. I had a team forming like a small nervous system. I could not unsee the sign in the lobby, but I could use it as a beginning. On my desk that day sat an item that had formerly belonged to my mother's purse, a small journal where she once recorded birthdays, recipes, tiny confidences. I opened it and found a note she'd written to herself years ago. "When something breaks, fix what you can. Let the rest teach you. It was the sort of homely wisdom that suddenly seemed like doctrine. Broken things can be fixed. People can be called to account. Lives can be remade. I made a list of what to do next. Evidence gathering was top. We would get forensic accountants, subpoena bank records, cross-check names, and trace transfers. We would speak to the bank about the authorization form with the signature that bore my name like a lie. We would speak to other victims privately, carefully. We would not, under any circumstances, name names publicly until we had court-ready evidence. Helen insisted on this like a mantra. Reputation can be weaponized by both sides. The law requires proof. That evening, back in the kitchen, I made a choice about the bedroom. For months I had been drifted toward accommodation, letting David's commute eat his nights, learning to accept pillow talk through a phone. I walked into the master bedroom carrying a box of old clothes. I began to repurpose it. I pulled out an old brown suit, the one I'd worn to interviews in my 30s, and set it where his shirts used to be. It sounds small. Maybe it was. But sometimes revolutions begin in drawers. I told myself I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing this for clarity and for justice. I wanted restitution, yes. I wanted the money that had been siphoned back. But more than that, I wanted the truth. Not because I loved the truth, but because a life that is based on truth is the only kind I can live in from that day forward. Then, one afternoon, I got a call that made the world tilt again. Marcus had found an account that traced to a small offshore holding company with a shell corporation name. It was not definitive yet, but the trace hinted at a larger web. My breath went shallow. Part of me wanted to cry out in panic. Part of me felt strangely alive, the kind of awake you get when a mystery turns into a case. "This is bigger than just us," Marcus said softly over the phone. "We should be careful." "We'll be careful," I promised, and the word came with the weight of something I hadn't used in a long time. I thought about how the lobby's digital sign, the small typeface that had named Sarah as Mrs. Henderson, had been the first crack. A little piece of evidence in a bright public place had toppled illusions. The rest would be professional and patient work. But as anyone who has lived through betrayal knows, patience isn't the same as passivity. You gather what you can, you build support, you do not let humiliation become the definition of who you are. The night before I was scheduled to meet the other women in person, I sat on my porch and listened to the city breathe. There are certain sounds that remind you that the world keeps going. A bus door sighing, a dog barking in the distance, the far-off scraping of a delivery truck. I thought about my mother, about funerals and promises, and how laughter had filled our small kitchen when David and I had first married. I thought about the photo shattered on the hearth and the way glass can look like snow when the light catches it. I picked up the phone and typed a message to the group chat. "Meet me at my house. Bring what you have. Bring receipts. Bring courage." I hit send and felt a small, steady kind of fear, the serious, useful kind. When Jennifer, Amanda, and Christina arrived, they came with envelopes and laptops and faces that had known this ache for longer than they'd liked. We sat around my dining table like conspirators and survivors. We traded dates and signatures and reassurances. For a while, we just let each other speak. Each of their stories fit like tiles into a mosaic I hadn't wanted to know existed. "Why would he do it?" Amanda asked at one point, voice thin. "Because he could," Jennifer said bluntly, "because someone paid him to be trusted." We made a plan to document everything and to move carefully. We would not make public accusations yet. We would be meticulous. We would be a united front if and when the time came to confront him publicly. There is power in numbers, and there is power in procedural patience. That night, I lay awake thinking about the lobby sign again, about Tom's laugh, about the way the building had, unknowingly, innocently, presented my sister as my husband's wife. The sign was not malicious. It was a small administrative convenience that had turned into a weapon. It showed how small things add up. A signature here, a habitual greeting there, a digital directory entry. That's all it takes for an ordinary life to become someone else's affair. I sat up and started a new list. What to do when the world offers you proof. First, gather. Second, document. Third, form your team. Fourth, move forward with purpose. It was not heroic to make lists. It was sensible. It preserved my dignity. And yet, in the quiet hours, I let myself imagine other things too. I imagined calling him out in a restaurant with every woman's eyes on him. I imagined a confrontation cold and clinical, one where we presented our receipts and signatures, and he could not talk his way out of it. I imagined standing tall with the other women as our evidence sat between us like a jury. But that was a fantasy, clean and bright. Real life has lawyers and subpoenas and long delays and private meetings. Real life has moments where you must wait for the law to move. That restraint is hard to accept when anger sharpens your tongue and humiliation makes the world a stage. I slept in short bursts that week, waking to headlines and to the small domestic noises of a life being examined. I walked to the mailbox as if each letter might have the answer. I found instead a notice from the bank about an account change. It was the kind of bureaucratic language that hides violence in plain terms. Please be advised, per consumer request. The words were neutral, but they had teeth. In my dreams, the lobby's directory glowed like a script I couldn't change. The title on it had been small and ordinary, Mrs. Henderson, but its consequences were anything but. The sign had placed a label on me that I did not recognize. I had to find out when that label was put there, who put it there, and why. That would be the work ahead, tracing the label back to the hand that wrote it. The next morning I stood at the lobby again. Tom saw me and lifted his chin in a private apology. Sarah did not look my way. David's office window looked down over the city like a judge waiting for a case to begin. I breathed in and out. I had begun to understand that the most painful thing about betrayal is not the act itself, but the slow cataloging of its evidence, the ledger of lost trust. I had already started assembling that ledger. I had already made allies. I had already decided I would not let humiliation be the end of my story. And yet, as I walked away from the building that day, I knew the road ahead would be long and full of legal knots. I also knew, with a clarity that felt like a hard blade of light, that I would not face it alone. I drove home and parked in my driveway, the blue dress folded in the passenger seat like a small, silent victory. Inside, the envelope with the forged authorization form waited on the table like a dare. I sat down, opened it, and read the signature again. It was my name, but not the me who sat there now. Someone else had written those letters in a way that disguised the tremors of a hand. Someone had weaponized my name. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "There's a trace," he said, "but it's a thread. It'll take time." "Start pulling," I told him. "Pull until the whole thing unravels." He paused, and I could hear the city through the line, the ordinary noise that carries on while lives are reinvented. "Be careful," he said finally. "I will be," I said, and I believed it. I hung up and looked at the photo on the mantel of my mother, the knitted coat, the smile that had once convinced me that the world was an honest place. Then I closed my eyes and made a promise to myself. I would get back whatever could be gotten, and I would build something so other women would not have to stumble through this alone. That latter thought felt like a light I could aim toward, a small organization of women who had been through the same fire and wanted to help others find the exit. I thought of a name, Truth Seekers, before I realized I'd said it aloud. Truth Seekers sounded like a group that would sift through lies with flashlights. It sounded practical. It sounded like recovery. I made a note on a pad and underlined it twice. A knock at the door broke the quiet. I opened it to see Sarah standing there, urgent and small, and for the first time, not blinking away the consequences of her actions. "I need to tell you everything," she said. I closed the door slowly and leaned against it. Outside, the world still spun with the steady indifference of commuters and deliveries and elevator pings. Inside, there was a life to be reordered, evidence to gather, a sister to reckon with, friends to consolidate into a team, and a lawyer and a private investigator to coordinate with. I made coffee and set another blue dress in the closet. There would be no more surprises like the one in that lobby. Not if I could help it. Not when the sign at the entrance had already shaken me awake. Sarah's eyes didn't dodge mine this time. She stood on my porch as if the city had narrowed down to that strip of hardwood and a doormat that still read, "Welcome," in polite, sun-faded letters. "Tell me everything," I said. It wasn't a request. She went straight past apologies and into logistics, the way people who are ashamed often do. Practical, breathless, wanting to get to the end of the story before the shame collapses. He told me to introduce myself as someone involved with his charity, said it would be easier that way, said it was just for a few meetings. He gave me a name badge. He said Mrs. Henderson would be fine. I thought he meant for work, for introductions. I didn't know. Her voice broke. I swear I didn't know about the accounts. I let her speak until the sound of words ran out. Then I asked the one question that matters. "When did you first see the directory with your name?" Her face went white. "The same week I moved in," she said. He showed it to me, on his phone, a picture. He said he had them set up as recurring visitors. He told me to arrive at 9. He said it would be a favor, Margaret. You agreed to be a favor? I thought it was for a charity event. He said he'd explain later. I didn't. The confession was a thin thing, but it was a beginning. Sarah's role had been identity theft of a private, domestic sort, an adoption of a name, a posture, a slot at someone's table. It was small theater that served a much bigger scam. We did not hug. We did not fake forgiveness. Instead, Sarah sat at my kitchen table and began to draw timelines in the margin of my legal pad. Names, dates, times she'd been in the building, people she'd spoken to. Small data turned into useful pattern. "Tell Marcus everything," I said later, handing her my phone. "Everything you can remember. Who you saw, dates, badge details, anything." She took the phone like it was a bridge to a life she wanted back. We moved methodically from that point. Marcus used what Sarah supplied as nodes on a map. He traced the times the directory logged recurring visitors and cross-referenced them with elevator swipe logs, another layer of administrative detail that no showman plans for. He subpoenaed records through the lawyer. Banks were slower, but the net began to close. Marcus had a way of explaining the messy arithmetic of fraud without making it feel like pure bureaucracy. "They don't usually do this all at once," he said. "They build trust, move money in small increments, and exploit conveniences, like a recurring visitor log or a receptionist who assumes the display is correct. People rely on protocols, and con men rely on that reliance." He was right. The directory, the small administrative ease of listing a recurring visitor, had been a fulcrum. In another case, it would have been nothing more than a calendar entry. In ours, it had been a marker of access. Helen pushed for official involvement. A private investigation and a stack of bank statements could do a lot, she argued, but wire fraud is federal by definition when it crosses state lines. Marcus's trace hinted at transfers into accounts registered in a known offshore jurisdiction. Helen arranged a meeting with a federal prosecutor she trusted, someone who knew how to set up a case without letting it leak to the press. We presented the first tranche of evidence, the signed authorization purporting to be mine, the copies of transfers, the list of clients I'd never heard of. The prosecutor's visor of professionalism didn't obscure the moment I watched an older woman who had seen many lies register what our papers meant. "We'll open a preliminary inquiry," she said. "If the bank records corroborate the transfers, and there are interstate wires and shell entities, This will be a federal matter. It felt enormous to hear the phrase federal matter. Part of me had expected the legal world to be a series of polite denials. Instead, there was movement, and that movement was what I had been trying to manufacture for weeks. Evidence was the engine. Patience was the fuel. Marcus found the first solid trail 18 months back, an emergency funding wire that had darted into an account with a corporate name that meant nothing to me. The corporate registration led to a Cayman address. There it was, a shell, a mailbox, a name that was a cipher. Marcus's quiet satisfaction when he turned those ciphered names into a paper path felt almost obscene in the face of what they'd funded. We also discovered regular transfers labeled with pet names he'd used with different women, tiny signals he'd probably thought were invisible. That pattern gave Helen leverage to approach the prosecutor with a narrative that matched the numbers, a man who used charm and recurring transactions to both seduce and siphon. Our small group of victims, Jennifer, Amanda, Christina, Rebecca, and I, weren't isolated incidents. We formed a cluster with similar signatures, apologies followed by requests, trust followed by transfer requests, followed by silence. Rebecca called separately. She worked in accounting for a manufacturing firm downtown and had recognized something in a spreadsheet months ago. She'd flagged an odd memo from Henderson's office but had been brushed off. "I didn't want to pry," she said. "But when your name turned up in the directory, Margaret, something felt wrong. We have systems." He'd found ways around them. Rebecca proved an invaluable ally. She knew how banks and books could get doctored, and she helped Marcus diagram the likely movement of funds. At Helen's insistence, and with Marcus's delicate pressure, we arranged one crucial piece of strategy: depositions and subpoenas timed to be simultaneous, preventing the defendant from cooling the paper trail between institutions. Helen likened it to a boxing match. Corner your opponent from different angles so he can't slide out. In the weeks that followed, the work blurred into a rhythm of small victories and discouraging delays. The FBI representatives we met were respectful and efficient. They explained civil and criminal remedies, walked through wire fraud statutes, and asked for patience. Financial crime investigations move like glaciers sometimes, one agent told us, but when the tide changes, they move fast. We prepared for the restaurant confrontation at Romano's the same way you prepare a speech or a surgery, with rehearsal, contingency plans, and the exact placement of evidence. Marcus had told us what would happen if the defendant tried to run. Banks would freeze accounts. Asset preservation orders would lock certain holdings. Helen had the ampersand of law working in her pocket. Subpoenas, motions, the threat of criminal indictment if there was obstruction. We were not taking a vigilante's joy in show. We wanted documentation, public testimony, and the kind of exposure that could turn a private pattern into prosecutable behavior. On the day of the confrontation, the women arrived separately, as planned. Romano's was a small, bustling place with white tablecloths and a violinist who played too close to sentimental music for my taste. The recorders were concealed in purses and suit linings. Marcus sat 2 tables away, his phone recording, and Helen had her phone on airplane mode. Practical caution. Someone had to catch every angle. David arrived spacious and confident, the way men like him practice in front of bathroom mirrors. Charm was his opening line. He threaded through the dining room the way a man in command does, expecting smiles and deferential nods. He sat, ordered, and reached for the breadbasket as if the ordinary rituals of being served were his natural state. The first moment I said his name, his face displayed the tiny flicker of recognition, and then the recalculation. He should have seen me. He'd seen me before. But he didn't see me in the way he used to. Margaret Foster was no longer a convenient shadow in his light. I took the seat across from him and put the folder on the table between us. He attempted the usual. "Maggie, you're here. This is a surprise." He said my nickname like it wrapped me in ownership. Charm isn't an apology, it's a preemptive pardon. The folder contained what it needed to: copies of the forged authorization, receipts, annotated bank statements that traced specific wires, emails in which he'd written in tones he used with each woman, pet names, coaxing, the same phrases repeated with different signatures. Jennifer, Amanda, and Christina each read a short, prepared statement about specific losses and the emotional toll. Rebecca explained how ledger entries had been manipulated to mask the transfers. I didn't want the spectacle to feel like cruelty. I wanted it to feel like a ledger being balanced. So I spoke in a tone that was even and cold, the opposite of what my heart was doing. "You used people's trust and my name to move money," I said. "You put my life in accounts I didn't know existed, and you took from other women what they could not afford to lose. We have copies of every transaction." David's expression slid from practiced pity to something narrower, composure thinned to calculation. He spoke then, the voice of someone who has been practiced in the small manipulative arts. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "There were investments, returns expected." "Expectations that you never met," Helen cut in, not raising her voice, but making the rest of the sentence unnecessary. "The subpoenas are filed. The record is clear. You can cooperate now and mitigate exposure, or you can allow the process to unfold and face criminal charges." That phrase, "cooperate now," is a hinge in law. It offers a chance to trade full confessional evidence for a more favorable negotiation. It was a lever Helen put down like a clear choice, someone who knows you must choose. I watched his face as the gravity of that choice pressed. For a man who had built himself on the confidence of always being able to speak his way out, this wasn't just about charm anymore. It was about whether he had prepared for the moment when paperwork mattered more than charisma. He asked for an hour to gather his thoughts, which in legal translation often means call an attorney. We let him go. Marcus and the FBI had already spoken to banks that morning, and Magnus, the line of procedural steps we'd anticipated, was beginning to move. There is a disproportionate power in documentation and timing. One wrong wire freezes a chain. One subpoena reveals a destination. The confession didn't come out that night. That was fine. What happened instead was public. His posture cracked in front of an assembled company of witnesses. He saw the weight of our proofs, and he left with the knowledge that his playbook had run out of clean pages. That night, social media did what social media does. Someone posted a blurred clip, and the story traveled through a small network of friends and acquaintances. We had not gone public on purpose. The world had a way of making its own windows of exposure. Once the federal inquiry was fully engaged, the pace quickened. Subpoenas arrived at banks. Marcus's small triumphs became legal pivots. Helen filed a motion for asset preservation. The banks complied. Accounts were frozen. The moment that had seemed so distant, the moment when an invisible line turned from private grievance into state-level indictment, arrived because of the coordinated pressure of several small, consistent truths. The day we received notice that David had been indicted on counts of wire fraud and identity theft, I felt a strange stillness. It was a formal, cold thing to be notified by mail. An indictment doesn't sound like vindication. It sounds like a list. But it was also evidence of movement. For weeks after the initial lobby scene, I had lived in a limbo where the small humiliations remained the loudest noise. The indictment muted those humiliations with procedure. When arrested, he did not leap or resist. There was no dramatic scene. Law enforcement acted efficiently, the way they do when the evidence is tidy. For the first time, the man who'd used 1,000 little smiles to keep people pliant found himself accounted for in black ink and statute. He was arraigned. He entered a plea of not guilty at first, as is common in federal cases while negotiations move. The discovery phase produced more damning materials, emails, recordings from Marcus, and crucially, internal notes showing he had discussed moving funds offshore to avoid traceability. The prosecutor offered a plea agreement after months of negotiation, one that required full cooperation, forfeiture of certain assets, restitution to identified victims, and a prison term. We were given the option to accept the plea terms laid out and avoid the uncertainty of a public trial, which can be long, expensive, and emotionally corrosive. The plea hearing was the kind of day that shapes the closing chapter of a long fight. David stood small in a courtroom that prioritizes gravity. He read a statement, carefully worded, practiced contrition, the tone of a man who had been coached in humility. He agreed to the terms, to assist in unraveling the network he'd helped build, to identify accounts and co-conspirators he knew, and to forfeit certain assets in exchange for a negotiated sentence. When the judge announced the sentence later, the number of months or years mattered less in the emotional ledger than the fact that there had been consequence. He would serve time. Restitution orders were made. Not all the money returned, because criminal restitution often cannot claw back every offshore transfer, but a portion did. Seized assets covered some of the losses. The federal system can be messy. It's not absolute reclamation. But it was a legal acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong and worth weighing. We celebrated in small, sensible ways. There was no champagne ricochet of joy. Instead, there were phone calls that lasted a long time, texts that read simply, "Thank you," and a lunch where the four of us, Jennifer, Amanda, Christina, and I, sat in a diner and didn't talk about him at all for 10 blessed minutes. That silence tasted like freedom. The aftermath of a prosecution is an odd stretch. For a while, you live in paperwork, restitution schedules, follow-up with banks, and a slow transfer of seized assets. You also have to manage the social currents. People ask you what happened as if it's a clickable story rather than a life. You also have to learn to be visible again without feeling like a subject for others' curiosity. Out of that slow, complicated recovery came Truth Seekers. It started as a notebook idea I made on a kitchen table, while Helen filled out more forms. We had language, patterns, an understanding of the bureaucratic grooves that con men exploit. Why should we keep this knowledge to ourselves? Why not make it into something practical? A nonprofit that offers legal orientation, support groups, and a way to compile and share red flags with financial institutions. We launched it quietly at first. A website with a resource page, a list of recommended lawyers in several states, and a forum moderated for privacy. Word traveled in the small channels of survivors. Women reached out asking for help parsing documents, for encouragement when banks stalled, for someone to sit with them in a lawyer's office. The work was granular and humane, helping someone collect statements, arranging a counseling referral, making introductions to forensic accountants who worked on contingency. Truth Seekers grew because we had a credibility the internet doesn't sell. We had walked the path. People like Jennifer ran workshops on reading bank statements. Rebecca gave seminars to small companies about internal controls. Helen volunteered to host webinars on the intersection of civil remedies and criminal prosecution. Marcus became a fixture in our Q&A sessions, showing people how to follow a paper trail without doing anything illegal themselves. We also worked to make reporting friendlier. Too often, victims described being treated like inconveniences at big institutions. We built a small packet, sample demand letters, clear steps to request a freeze, the right language to use with compliance departments. It sounds prosaic, but when your accounts have been rearranged by someone else, prosaic can be salvation. On a personal level, I started to dismantle the coalition of habits that had kept Henderson's name in my life. I changed my email signatures and took a small legal step to remove him from joint accounts where he had no legitimate claim. I reclaimed my social media handles where they had been under his surname. I told a few friends off for using that nickname that made me sound smaller. Reclaiming a name felt performative and also essential. There is a practical magic in the letters we use to introduce ourselves. Robert was there in the quieter moments. He did not rush to label things. He offered a friendship that did not demand the full expiation of my wounds in one breath. He met with Helen a couple of times and asked respectable questions about support, about how to be helpful. He came with casseroles and with banal, solid things. help taking the trash to the curb, a call during a long subpoena deadline. He did not try to fix the past for me. He shared present company. Over time, that steadiness morphed into something tender that did not require drama to prove its authenticity. There were nights when I still woke with the memory of the lobby's directory, its thin typeface and Sarah's thumbnail in the corner. Those nights passed more quickly as months went by. The image of the broken photo on the hearth dried in my memory into a marker rather than a wound. I found myself more often reaching for the journal my mother had kept than the fractured portrait, to scribble plans, to cross things off. Truth Seekers eventually worked with a small consortium of community banks. We ran a pilot program on better identity verification for recurring visitor entries and staff training on how to spot internal inconsistencies. We fed our anonymized cases to a university's criminology program and helped create a short module on social engineering for corporate receptionists. These were small wins, but they mattered. Prevention is a different kind of justice, less about punishment and more about protection. The women who had been my allies became, in many ways, my family. We had dinners where we were allowed to be ordinary. We had fundraisers where the first wall of our presentations was, what not to do when something in your life feels off. The stories we told were not about glory. They were about the slow knitting of community and a practical belief in accountability. Months later, Sarah came back into my life with work to do. She testified, reluctantly but honestly, about the way she'd been introduced as Mrs. Henderson and the conversations she'd had. Her testimony complicated our narrative. She was both complicit and coerced in different degrees. The law had ways of parsing that. Public sentiment had fewer patience for nuance. We never pretended it was simple. She attended group sessions, and she helped us create a small outreach for people whose family members had been manipulated into participating in schemes. It is an odd, necessary truth that betrayal often comes in mixed packages. The restitution we received was not full. Some money was gone into the ether of offshore accounts that would take years to untangle. But the partial financial recovery was less meaningful to me than the legal accounting that had happened. There was acknowledgement, there were consequences, there were institutional changes. Those things do not erase the harm, but they make future harm less likely. Over the next year, I cut the Henderson furniture from my life. I sold a handbag that had belonged to a season of carefully curated appearances and donated the money to a fund we set up through Truth Seekers to assist women who couldn't afford forensic accounting. I updated my will and my estate plans and made sure everything reflected my name and my intentions. These were administrative acts, but they felt like reclamations, small protocols for the rest of a life. When the dust had settled enough that routine loomed again, I invited the women to a small ceremony at a community center to mark the founding of Truth Seekers as a nonprofit. We did not make it about us. It was about service, an intake form, a helpline number, a list of vetted professionals. We made a pledge to handle cases with confidentiality and to work with law enforcement to build stronger responses. I often thought, in those months, about how easily a small administrative convenience, an entry in a digital directory, had become so consequential. It had been a trivial piece of infrastructure that, combined with charm and opportunism, did a lot of damage. The lesson was practical. Systems are only as good as the humans who guard them. And the other lesson was human. Trust is not a blank check. It must be accompanied by verification when someone's words and actions require it. As for Robert and me, we moved carefully. We dated honestly, without performances or theatrical surprises. He met my friends, took an interest in my work, and sat quietly while I read legal papers occasionally, because that was how my life now had to be. He did not try to replace the life I'd lost. He offered to share the new one I was building. My public name changed in small ways. In a talk I gave to a women's group, I introduced myself as Margaret Foster and spoke about evidence and community and the slow art of rebuilding. My voice had an edge still, but it had softened into something like clarity. People came up after to ask about details, to share their own stories. Those conversations were the reason truth seekers had been born. One person's pain can be a map for another person's avoidance. The lobby entrance, the sign, Tom's laugh, the way the digital directory had reflected my sister's face instead of mine, remained a vivid memory. But it no longer defined me. It was the place where everything began to be seen, and from that seed, something larger had been cultivated. A group, a way to help, and a new life that was honest. I tell the story not because I want sympathy, nor because I relish the fall of a man who once commanded admiration. I tell it because the mechanics of deceit are mundane, and because the antidote is also mundane. Paper, signatures, a lawyer who cares, a private investigator who will trace a thread, friends who will help you document, and the insistence to insist. Humiliation can be corrosive, but it can also be catalytic if you use it to create structure where before there was only the flimsy architecture of someone else's story. Sometimes people ask if I'm angry. The short answer is yes. Anger is an honest currency when someone betrays you. But it's not the only currency I learned to spend. I spent efforts on evidence instead of endless rage. I invested in systems and in people who knew how to convert pain into procedure. That felt more productive than applause for spectacle. Truth Seekers still exists. We still get calls. We still meet with women who have been asked for money or names or signatures. We still go into corporate lobbies and suggest small policy changes that make big differences. We do not promise miracles. We promise process, support, and a network that reduces the shame of being targeted by something that looks, in its first moments, like ordinary life. If there is a final thing I want to say to anyone listening now, it is this: guard your name. Watch how it is used. Keep copies of your documents. Photograph your statements. Trust kindness, but verify transactions. Build witnesses, friends who know the small patterns of your life, professionals you know are honest. When someone you love is revealed to be someone else, you might feel adrift. Make a list. Gather. Call a lawyer. Call a private investigator. And if you can, find allies, people who will keep you from spinning alone. For me, the sign at the entrance was the shock that started everything. What followed was slow, meticulous, and often exhausting work. But it led to accounting, to law, to a kind of restitution, and to a community that does the hard thing of listening and helping. My name is Margaret Foster. I am not Henderson. My identity is not a plaque in a lobby. It's the sum of the people I help, the organization I helped build, and the everyday decisions to be careful, brave, and kind. If this story touched you, if you've seen something similar, or you want to share a resource, please leave your story in the comments below. If you or someone you know needs help, check the link in the description for resources from Truth Seekers and a list of vetted professionals who can assist. You don't have to go through it alone.